So the I-STARR project is supported by a grant from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. It's part of a larger NIH Helping to End Addiction Long-Term Initiative, or HEAL initiative, and it is one of the several projects that comprise the Consortium on Addiction Recovery Science, or the COARS network. So this training is the fourth webinar in the I-STARR training series, but the third training that is geared to those who are operators or providers of recovery housing. What does that mean? It means that we've developed webinars with specific information about recovery housing that may be particularly useful to folks who own, operate, manage, or otherwise assist in the day-to-day activities or functioning of recovery housing, whether they be the CEO of a large recovery housing organization or a senior resident with governance or management responsibilities. We also encourage other stakeholders who are unfamiliar with activities that recovery residents operators engage in to attend these webinars to get a better sense of what operators do and what residents receive while living in recovery housing. Next slide, please. So I am Carmen Masson. I'm a professor at the Department of Psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco. I co-lead the I-STARR project with Amy Miracle, and she's a research scientist in the Alcohol Research Group at the Public Health Institute. The team also includes co-investigators Sarah Zemore, Lenny Jason, biostatisticians Meena Subbaraman and Lebo Lee, and communications specialist Diane Schmidt and Dustin Pizzo. Our project coordinator is Quinoja Capitani. Next slide, please. We are also really very fortunate to be working with an advisory board. The I-STARR project activities include 17 members of a diverse group of leaders from across the country. While most advisory board members wear many different hats, they represent recovery and recovery housing leaders, treatment providers and payers, national policy advocates, as well as researchers and educators. And some of the presenters are actually serve on our advisory board, and some of the attendees here may be serving on the advisory board as well. Next slide, please. Now we have three different presenters for this webinar. I'm delighted that Joe Bagley, Beth Fisher-Sanders, and George Brock are here with us today. Joel currently serves on the NAR board and co-chairs the Affiliates Committee, which provides technical assistance and guidance to emerging state-level affiliate organizations. We will also be hearing from Beth Fisher-Sanders, and her experience is equally impressive. Beth is a writer, trainer, mentor, and advocate for ethical and standards-based recovery housing and support services and community building. And last but not least, we will also hear from George Brock. George has over 14,000 hours of psychotherapy, supervision, and applied community psychology experience, which has focused on professional and peer workforce development that emphasizes continuous service quality and program outcome improvement. So with that introduction, I'm so pleased to hand things off to our presenters to share information on the topic of recovery residence policies. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr.
Next slide, please.
So let's start off with a few poll questions, find out who we got in the audience and kind of what your background or experience is. If you go ahead and launch that poll, the first question says, who or whose are you? And you can select all that apply. Maybe you're a recovery residence owner or operator or staff. Maybe you're a recovery residence resident, say that 10 times real fast, or a certified licensed clinician, or a researcher, academic, or other, or maybe none of the above. And secondly, have you accessed the policies and procedures of your state NAR affiliate? and or other recovery residences in your area. And your choices are yes, no, or wait, what? Do I have a state NAR affiliate? Third question, as you scroll down, I have experience writing policies and procedures. And you choose one of the options of yes, no, or not applicable. And then the last question asks, do you love writing policies and procedures? With one being no, not so much, and five, extremely, I find it extremely enjoyable. So if you would go ahead and answer all four of those, we'll give you a few more seconds. Excellent. So looks like most folks have access to the the policies and procedures of your NAR affiliate. Got a few that didn't know if you had a state affiliate, and you can always go to naronline.org, and right there on the home page, you'll see the states that have a NAR affiliate. You can click on your state, and if nothing comes up, then you don't have one yet. Looks like we're almost evenly split between yes and no in terms of policy and practices writing experience. And then most folks, yeah, not so much love and write policies and procedures, but we do have a few geeks in the crowd who are fours and fives. It's like about 29%. Yeah, that's very helpful. And it's good to know we've got some people who appreciate the importance of doing that work. So next slide, please. So what we'd like to do here in the next 45 minutes or so is express the importance of recovery residences policies and use this metaphor of a recipe. And the question is, so what's in your recipe? Well, we'd like for you to be able to assess the congruency of your recovery residence policies and procedures to your organization's mission, vision, and values. And then describe the core recovery residence policies and procedures and their implementation in daily operations. And then lastly, be able to identify essential policies and procedures for any level of recovery residence operation. Next slide, please.
So one of the first questions that comes up for those who haven't had a lot of experience is, so what's the difference between policies and procedures and the rule book that I have for my residents? And first off, I'll say, no, they're not the same. We all have, just about everybody has a resident handbook, and it usually includes a set of rules and guidelines and et cetera. But those are for the residents. The policy and procedures are here specifically for the operation of the recovery residence. And that has to do with those of us who operate that and who are staff, volunteer or paid or otherwise. So that's what we're going to be looking at, is policies and procedures, not rules. Next slide, please.
And
Beth?
yeah, this is really getting at the why of because, and I was interested to see the polling results. There was a time where I would have put a low number by wanting to do policies and procedures, but after almost 30 years of doing, well, over 30 years of doing this work, I have come to find that these are foundational and really a shining light for how to navigate challenges within a recovery residence. So last month, Joel and I talked a bit about using mission, vision, and values to guide for how to proceed. But policies and procedures are the practical application of when we have an issues and even a problem within the residents. What do we do? What exactly do we do, and how do we do it consistently? Because that consistency, as we'll talk about, is part of how we create safety in the recovery residents. So to use our recipe card metaphor, the mission and vision are an invitation to the meal that we're preparing, but the policy and procedure is actually the guide or the book, the recipe book for how to make the meal consistently. And we do that objectively. So let's look further at that metaphor. Next slide, please. So I'm wondering if some of you are new to policy and procedure writing, or want a perspective that you might not have had about it. And we got excited, Joel, George, and I, thinking about, yeah, it really is a recipe. The rule, if we have a rule for, think about something that happens in your recovery residence, such as your resident has to leave for whatever reason. You've got a rule about conditions for leaving, but the policy and procedure guides you on how that happens. So your policy is the top line, the what you're making. So let's call it exit. Okay, you might put exit. That's the what, the dish that you're making. And then you have the second part of your recipe. Okay, so building on policy, you've got the basis for that, and that is your why. So why is this what important to the recovery resident? Well, an exit policy establishes really core guidelines for how people leave the recovery residence. And the why even goes into the variables or the ingredients. The variables are the ingredients of this recipe. So what is the variable on a certain exit policy? And then the procedure itself is how. Okay, it's the how we put that together to create the exit for resident, and we'll build on that. So 3 core parts, and that is your policy and your basis and your procedure. And that's a simple formula that you can write in any way that is relevant for your recovery residents. Anything more to add to that, George or Joel?
No, I think you said that very well, Beth.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Well, let's build on that and think about the book. George, let's go on to the next slide and think about our recipe book.
Okay. So this is the kind of the ongoing conversation between the cook and the cook's assistants, if you will. So you may have it all written down in the recipe book, but fundamentally, the policy and procedures document is a living and relevant part of the organization. And ideally, it gets reviewed on a regular basis and can be modified as you get more and more experience and things happen and you react to those things and you learn from what worked well last time and what might be better next time. So it's a way of having somewhat creative discussions as opposed to the critical kind of discussion where you say, yeah, we're not doing this anymore. And it's about getting that feedback from both the resident as well as any staff who may be engaged with the resident about how well this recipe is working. Is it cooked too long? Is there too much of gumbo or not enough garlic powder? And as you tweak it, you'll find, I think, that your effectiveness at moving beyond having rules to having guidelines that actually make sense and can be explained by something other than because I said so becomes the foundation for how you operate the recovery residence. So that's the way we suggest you go about creating this recipe book. What else would you and Joel like to add, Beth?
Well, I like the pictures that we're putting in here. Like the one, I think you have some salt, a little bit of salt, a little bit of flour. Well, for the first time you try a procedure, actually, I think about in my own residence, the policies and procedures, various ones have probably been updated at least 10 times, because what was relevant for, say, an exit strategy 20 years ago is not relevant today. And we've had to add some salt here and take away some flour there to make it applicable. And I think that's a really important part of what you're talking about, George, is that your policies and procedures are only as effective as their real-time applicability to operations. And they provide the objective way to conduct those operations, which is essential, because if you are doing things one way for this resident and another way for that resident, that creates havoc in your community, as well as making things up as you go along. And truth be told, when I was starting out, that was me. And as I quickly found out, you can't create safety by making up policies, because I was one of those operators that thought rules, those 20 rules, basic rules we start out with, were policies and procedures. I didn't know what I didn't know.
Well,
And you know what?
Oh,
Go
Joel.
ahead, George. No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that the idea is that as you do this, you actually develop some routine, and it's probably better cast as rituals, both in terms of how you welcome people into the community and what you do in order to make them feel heard, understood, and respected, how they move through the various phases of your program, and then how do you say goodbye? All of that becomes part of the meat and potatoes, if you will, of how your recovery residence operates. And it gets captured in that policy and procedures document in order to more efficiently and effectively bring staff along and understanding that it's a ritual that adds meaning and value to the experience of being part of this recovery residence.
Yeah, and what I was going to add, George, is I like your term ritual, but in that over time, as we, like Beth said, we started the same way. We had a bunch of rules, but very few policies and procedures. But over time, as we got those developed, it became, anytime something came up that we were like, oh, what are we supposed to do in this situation? It became our ritual to say, well, what does our policy say? And that just, it sort of almost became a little mantra, what does our policy say? Because we knew that, well, we can always do something different, But let's start with what did we come up as our policy? Because that's where we spent time when we weren't under the pressure of trying to solve a problem. So I was going to say, as we move into this next slides, this next exercise here that Beth is going to lead us through and get us started here. I just wanted to tell everybody. So we're gonna actually like sort of go through a process of creating a policy and procedure, what's involved. And we want you to participate as well via the chat. So as we're talking about the policy, the basis, and then eventually we'll get to the procedure, feel free to add your own input in the chat box, because that's we want to show you, like, this is how it should be done. Back to that, let's be creative in our process and not very rigid and critical of like, oh no, we can't do that. Anyway, Beth, why don't you take us through this?
Yeah. So we thought that confidentiality in resident records would be a good, safe, non-controversial policy to start with. And so this is a pretty standard policy description, the what of our recipe. What are we making? So we're trying to make a policy on confidentiality and keeping of resident records. So policy is the right to confidentiality of all residents regarding the verbal and written information. It will be protected in compliance with federal and state laws that will be met. Okay, so that's the policy that we want to create, the what, and then the basis, the why, because we want to uphold the confidentiality and protect the right to privacy at your recovery residence. And so basis too, I want to note your basis, if you get stuck on the why, link it back to your mission, vision, and values. That will guide you. And there should be, as you're writing, a flavor of that in your basis. Okay. So then, go ahead.
Well, I'm curious, what do people think the basis really is of confidentiality? Why is this such a relevant issue for recovery residents? You throw that in chat. Stephen says Oasis states we cannot keep confidential records in New York.
Yeah, and Stephen, I know that's true, and hey, it's good to hear from you. And you can still have a confidentiality policy for your residents. And I would suggest that that's a good way to operate that. How can we guide our residents in being confidential with each other? Okay, so I'll just give that to you to think about. And hint, it could be something like residents sign a statement of confidentiality coming in. That's a pretty common one. So yeah, I hear what you're saying about the records, but it can be more than that. And it's important to resident safety, isn't it?
And Theodora says it's about protection, and Richard says it's to protect the residents from harm.
Good. Yes, absolutely. All of those can be written verbatim as you put them in the chat into this basis. Excellent.
At least to some extent, this forms the basis of kind of, can I trust you? Can I talk about things that are troubling, even deeply disturbing, and know that it's not going to be spread all over town? And most, we have that need, and it's maintained by the groups that we become a part of. And a confidentiality policy and procedure is a way of making that plain for everybody who comes into the recovery residence.
Yes. Yeah, and we ourselves need to feel protected in being there, that I need to know my roommate is not going to go tell maybe my husband or ex-husband that I've been in a contentious relationship with, that I'm even there.
Yeah.
You know, so it is about safety.
And Deodora says it's not only about harm, but about bias.
Mm.
And Jody says, yeah, it's continued stigma and discrimination within various settings that are the challenge. And Anna says that our rules say anonymity and our policy states protected health information.
Ah, good. So let's look at procedure and how we write the actual how-to and implementation of these two essential ingredients. We have the next slide, please. Okay, so your directions, your procedure. So here are some examples of things that you could put into a confidentiality procedure, that all staff, board members, and volunteers of your recovery residence will adhere to the current confidentiality laws as a best practice. And another, that residents will be informed upon entry, I think is a better word, of their rights to confidentiality and be given the opportunity to sign consent forms for the release of information. And that residents may choose whether or not to sign, always have choice in there, and that they may revoke that release at any time. So and there would be release forms involved. And upon entry, the staff will explain and the residents will sign a resident confidentiality. So you're actually taking step by step and do in detail what that looks like, what that conversation and process looks like upon resident entry. And that the agreement is for the purpose of ensuring confidentiality among the residents and building trust. So this is, let's see, there are 3 entries, directions to this, and you could have 4 times as many directions or points to consider in a confidentiality procedure. So let's do this together. Let's write some procedures that you don't see here, or points to consider in confidentiality within a recovery residence that we could build into a procedure. So what don't you see here?
And Beth, I
Put
just
it in
want
the
to
chat.
point out to everybody too, you just were, as you were doing this, it was a good example of why this is a living document. It's not just written and done on the fly. You were making edits to this because, like using the word admission, you know, as we have evolved over, I'll say the last 20 years, admission was a very common term for someone coming into recovery residence. As we've moved more toward a social model and it's a residence and it's where they live, admission doesn't seem to fit anymore. And so you changed it on the fly to maybe we should change this upon entry. And so I just wanted to point out to people, that's how these things stay alive and change as you change, as your organization change, and as the times change. Okay.
Right.
Didn't mean to interrupt what you were doing, but back to it. Yes. Go ahead, folks, and input some things in chat here for us. And what are some other procedures that could be added here?
Well, I'll throw one out. Who has access to the residents' records? Does other residents? Does the house manager? Does the janitor? Of course, I don't know any recovery residents have janitors, but that should be spelled out.
This can be, you can have a procedure, all those entry materials that you get, the general information, the releases we just talked about, where are those stored? To George's point, are they stored online? Do you have an electronic file system? If so, outline that. You know, it could say something as simple, all entry materials and patient resident information needs to be uploaded into our Google Drive or whatever it is that you have, or our information is stored in a locked cabinet that only name your people have access to.
Monica says only staff that have direct resident contact are allowed access to those documents. And Ron says, who vets the owners and the operators of recovery residences? Interesting. Alexis says a lot of our houses use the one-step platform. And then Ron says also, it starts with the integrity of the owner and the operator. And Alexis says that way the resident can access their personal documents at any time, and the house operator can also reference them as well. So let's go back to Ron's question of who vets the owners and the operators of recovery residences.
That's a great question. And one that I don't think we have a succinct answer to, do we?
Well, and to some extent, how that often gets determined is by the satisfaction of the of the residents themselves. In other words, if it's a place where I feel safe and secure and valued, then I'm likely going to say to other people, this is a good place to be. If it's not, I might just kind of sit on my hands and do my time and then get out. And yeah, I'm not going to necessarily endorse the place. And I might even speak out against sending more people there. But if you happen to have a NAR affiliate, ideally, your state has developed a certification process that in fact says that this organization has met the minimum standards necessary to operate. And that's where the NAR affiliate comes in.
The things that we are talking about in this and really any module that we presented thus far are the minimum standards for recovery residence operation according to the National Alliance for Recovery Residents standard version 3. And that encompasses 31 different standards for recovery residence operation. The first domain is a lot about this facet of operation, which is policy and procedure specific protocols for operation that need to be present for any level of recovery residence operation. And so, yeah, to your point, Steve, it could be that I'm a level 1 or 2 and don't have sensitive health information, not allowed to do that at my level. But some needs for confidentiality, creating safety within my resident community. And then there is some protocols. So I like what we've written so far. Some ones that aren't on here are about residents keeping safe with each other and keeping confidentiality, what we can and can't say outside of the residence. And then we can get as elevated as what we need to share among staff. If you have a staff, who gets to see what. So you can write as many procedures as your organization level needs, and the higher the NAR level, which is 1, 2, 3, or 4, the more procedures invariably need to be in place.
And Beth, this is probably a good place to point out too that NAR provides these standards, but they don't provide a set of policy and procedures that everyone has to abide by, because there are, just as we've had different people weigh in with their different emphasis, that every recovery residence is a little bit different. And what's important at one may be not as important somewhere else. So it's the policy and procedure needs to be tailored specifically to the recovery residents. We are coming up on 30 minutes, just to let Beth and George know.
Yep. Let's move on to some essential policies and procedures then. And this is true for any of those levels of recovery residents. There are thousands of different recovery residences in our country, but they can be distilled to the 4 different types of recovery residences that were presented in the first I-STARR presentation. And so these essential policies and procedures are what need to be a part of any level of recovery residence, starting with an entry policy and procedure. And then we've referenced the exit policies and procedures, both the planned, that they move on in a planned way, or the unplanned, reoccurrence or relapse or medical emergency. And then we have the operational, the day-to-day policy and procedures, such as what are your resident rules? What is your drug testing policy? How do you create an alcohol and illicit drug-free environment? There's a lot of policies that can be written about just that one, how to create that environment. Drug testing can fall into this too. How you do drug testing. What are your search protocols? How do you do what triggers a search? How do you do med storage? Those are essential. And then the resident rights and responsibilities that include confidentiality that we just talked about, but also, very importantly, if a resident or their family member has a grievance, how is that handled? What are your financial policies and procedures, several that can be written around that. So 4 bullets, but at least 9 different policies and procedures in those 4 bullets themselves. So those are the foundation for daily operation that we encourage you to consider.
And one of the things that distinguishes recovery residences from clinical services is that the resident has to learn a reciprocal responsibility. In other words, it's not just about what is good for me. And as I think Ron said, it's recovery residents are often early in recovery, and so they need more involvement and endorsement, and it's going from a focus on me and what I need in order to continue this thing called Big R recovery to my responsibility for not just me, but for this context or this environment or this community that I'm now a part of and the people who are living here. And so the reciprocity that gets built into it is the kind of the basis for the social model. And that's the difference between having rules where you are expected to comply versus having policies and procedures and guidelines where you are expected to contribute to the quality of the environment by doing certain things or engaging in certain rituals and policies and practices that really help everybody learn how to do this thing called Big R recovery. And it's so much further down the road than what I have to do just so that I protect my sobriety. It's about how do we have this place where we all feel safe and secure.
Good.
And this is probably a good place to introduce here, Beth. I think we could have done it a little earlier, but the NAR does provide a training series for recovery residence operators. And then in that training series, it takes you through each of the standards. And as part of that training system, there are templates for policies and procedures on all the required policies and procedures. So I think we had I can't remember who was supposed to drop the link in there, but as we move into the resources section of here, I just wanted to point out that one, especially that there is a whole NAR training series. It's 20 hours, roughly 20 to 30 hours, depending on how quick you are with doing some, or how thorough you are with doing some of the homework requirements and stuff, but an online training series. Anyway, and that leads us to our
Dustin
resources.
Put that into the chat, the resources that you just mentioned, Joel.
Great.
That's
we
great.
see it.
Yeah, and we've also got a template in there that you can
Next slide,
have
please.
of how to create a policy and procedure, so that you can take that away with you today and build it out for all of the things that we've listed. And those 9 would be where I'd suggest you start. Write 9 policy and procedures on those topics if you don't have them for your recovery residents. So a little homework for you.
Right. So there's only so much that we can cover in an hour-long webinar. So we've provided additional tools for you, journal articles that provide more information about operating recovery housing and recovery housing policies. It also, as Beth said, contains useful tools that recovery housing operators can use to assess aspects of their homes. In addition to listing these on the slide, we'll also paste the resources into the chat for you. Okay, So thank you. Next slide, please. So this gives us some time for now. Any questions that you may have, we want to open up to the audience. You can raise your hand virtually. And then we also have somebody who's monitoring the chat, and you can put your questions into the chat. But this gives us a time for us to reflect on what was discussed and to answer any questions that you may have.
One of the questions I had when I was starting out is how do I get started? Because to me, it was very tedious work. I hadn't connected the actual policy and procedure to what happens in day-to-day life of the recovery residents. So I really had a block about just sitting down to write so that I could be certified. And so I used the community to help me with that. I found people, and one person in particular who had a lot of expertise in writing policy and procedure and actually liked to do it. And so he guided me in the setup of those policy and procedures and discerning what was needed at my level of recovery residence operation. And we were able to come up with an initial recipe book that I think then was maybe 25 pages. Today in 2023 has grown to be 80 plus pages to accommodate all of the different scenarios. And what now is actually enjoyable in the experience of policy and procedure writing is that at 2 out of 4 staff meetings, we are looking at a policy and procedure and collaborating on it together. And this is how that recipe book has been updated over time, is that let's look at this. Is this relevant for today? What works? What actually is now obscure? Take that out. And what needs to be added to make it a living, relevant recipe.
Mhm. Any other questions?
Well, and I'm curious, Beth, how do the staff react to spending that much time talking about policies and procedures?
Well, that's a great question, because you would think that would be a humdrum staff meeting, but it is not. It is a discussion, and we use it to compare notes, because we have men's and women's communities, and some things might need to be adjusted given the variables, the ingredients that are considered. And then how do we make those adjustments in a way that actually can and does apply to everyone? So we often will get stuck on just that one part, one direction of the recipe itself, and discuss it for 2 or 3 weeks.
What? So you mean you don't treat women and men exactly the same?
Well, actually, no.
There's a question in the chat. Okay, I see policy regarding handling residents that stop paying rent for various reasons.
That's a great question. A very common dilemma, isn't it? Where that start with your actual financial document for your residents. That's their guide. And that document, their financial agreement, reflects your policy on finances for residents. So that policy can include things like, how do they pay? When do they pay? Where? All of that is part of your policy and procedure. And then if there is a hardship, financial hardship, that's also reflected in your policy. That piece is important for residents to know, so then you translate that into your resident document. If monthly payment can't be made by the 5th standard date, we would like you to do A, B, C, talk to management, make a plan for a payment arrangement, whatever it is that fits for you. You've got that documented in your recipe book, but also for your residents in their financial agreement.
Mhm.
And
Thank
the
you.
same thing actually applies for people who are scholarshiped into a program. And so the question often is, so what's your plan for how you're going to pay back that scholarship? And I don't necessarily mean with cash, but what are you going to do to contribute something back so that you're not just getting a free ride? And that can be a challenge.
Mhm. Thank you both. There's another question in the chat. Will there be a webinar on the resident rule book?
Yes and no. I think that's a lot of what we will be talking about here in April with common issues and challenges for recovery residences. The resident rules, another word I would suggest is guidelines. You know, that if I've got rules, I as somebody with addictive tendencies tend to want to break them. But if I've got guidelines, well, those are something I can follow with community. So not specifically, but yes, we can certainly address some of that when we get together, come back in April.
Mhm.
And speaking of rules, that if you're not sure where to start on some of your policy and procedures, if you have a set of rules, start there. Go, do I have a policy? I don't know if you're like me, but when I started up a recovery residence, there was a whole community of people I knew and everybody shared information. And I got a set of rules from another recovery residence. And there were 47 rules or something like that, and over it, I just started there and then later realized, oh, why do I have all these rules? Like no taking a shower after 2 a.m. It was so, that's a good place to start is look at your rules that you have. And then if you don't have an actual policy and a procedure for it, write a policy and procedure with the basis that for why you have that rule.
Mhm.
Or guideline, as Beth would encourage us to use.
Yes. And I hope everybody understands that distinction because it's relevant in more traditional clinical environments. There's all kinds of rules and things you have to do because a third party or somebody above you says you have to do it. Whereas in recovery residence, it's more about how do we take care of ourselves and the other people who are living in this environment with us. And that shared responsibility is the basis for the guidelines that help make this place a safe and sober place for all of us to live.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, the three of you. This has been an excellent discussion. I hate to cut you off, but we're going to move on to talk a little bit about the upcoming webinars that we have. We are hosting another webinar later this month, one that is specifically geared toward those who want to begin conducting research on recovery housing. And the researcher webinar will focus on principles of community-based participatory research. And the webinar will be hosted by, presented by Dr. Kathy Berlew, as well as we'll have some examples from a researcher who's done research at Oxford Houses, Dr. Lenny Jason. In October, we'll also have 2 webinars, again, with different tracks, one for operators and providers, as well as one for those who are conducting research on recovery housing. And the recovery housing provider operator webinar will be on the topic of law, ethics, and fiscal responsibility. And this will be led by NAR leadership. And our researcher webinar will be on the topic of recruitment and tracking of marginally housed and legal system involved study participants. And this will feature Betsy Hall and Liz Mahoney. And the I-STARR webinars are always held on Tuesdays from 11 to 12 on the for those on the West Coast, which is 2 to 3 for folks on the East Coast. And the operator provider webinars are as well as the webinars that are germane to all stakeholders, which we call the all audience webinars, are held on the first Tuesday of the month, and the researcher webinars on the 3rd Tuesday of the month. Thank you. Next slide, please. So before we sign off, I want to talk directly to those who have registered for the provider training series or who are considering registering for it. The webinar counts for 12 trainings in the provider training series, and those who attend all 12 webinars in the series will receive a certificate of completion and will be provided the option of being identified on the I-STARR website as someone who has completed the training. So you can also earn 12 NADAC CEU credits given at the end of the provider training series. So if you're registered for the provider series, or if you think you would like to register for it, we ask that you fill out a brief webinar evaluation, which needs to be completed so that it can count toward your participation in this webinar toward the NADAC CEU credits. So this is really important. So this evaluation will pop up on your screen in a separate browser when you exit the meeting. And again, if you're not yet registered and would like to, you can still do so on the I-STARR website. So regardless of whether you're registered for the full series, it's been a delight sharing this information with you, and we hope to see you back again here for another webinar down the road. And again, the next provider webinar is Tuesday, October 3rd. Thank you so much for your attention, and we hope to see you again and appreciate all of the presenters. Thank you.
Thanks. Shall be well.